There was a time when they told themselves that distance would fix everything, that the pressure, the expectations, the emotional weight of being close to someone was just too much. They believed that if they stepped back, if they created space, if they slowly let things fade, they would finally feel calm again. And for a moment, it even felt that way. The silence felt peaceful at first. The absence of emotional conversations, the absence of deep connection, the absence of someone asking how they really felt, it all felt like relief, like taking a deep breath after being underwater too long. They told themselves this was what they needed: freedom, space, independence, no one to disappoint, no one to get too close, no one to expect anything from them. But what they didn't realize was that silence has a second phase. And that phase doesn't feel peaceful at all, because eventually the quiet stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like emptiness. At first, they distracted themselves. They filled their days with routines, with work, with scrolling, with conversations that didn't go too deep. They kept themselves busy enough to avoid thinking about what was missing. They told themselves they were fine. They told themselves they preferred it this way. But nights have a way of telling the truth. When everything slows down, when the noise fades, when the distractions run out, that's when reality starts creeping in. The bed feels bigger. The room feels quieter. The phone feels heavier when it doesn't light up the way it used to. And even if they won't admit it out loud, there's a small, uncomfortable feeling growing inside them. Not pain exactly, not regret yet. Just a strange, unfamiliar loneliness that they didn't expect. Because here's what they never realized: they didn't just walk away from pressure, they also walked away from warmth. They didn't just escape expectations, they also lost understanding. And the first nights without you started to show them that it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't some big emotional breakdown. Avoidants rarely experience things like that in obvious ways. Instead, it was subtle, quiet, a moment where they reached for their phone out of habit, then paused. A thought that crossed their mind, like they would have laughed at this, or they would have understood the situation, and then the realization you weren't there anymore. And they tried to brush it off. They told themselves it was just habit, just routine, just a normal adjustment. They said to themselves, I'm better off this way. I don't have to worry about anyone else's feelings. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to deal with emotional conversations. And for a while, that story felt true, because avoidants are very good at convincing themselves that independence is always better than connection. They learned that lesson early in life. Somewhere along the way, closeness started to feel risky. Vulnerability started to feel dangerous. Depending on someone started to feel like a trap. So they built this identity around being strong alone, around needing no one, around being emotionally self-sufficient. But independence, when it's real and healthy, doesn't feel cold. It doesn't feel empty. It doesn't feel like something is missing. And slowly, without even realizing it, they started to feel the difference. They started to notice that their independence didn't actually feel peaceful. It felt flat, like life had lost a certain color, like conversations felt more surface level, like laughter didn't last as long, like something important had quietly disappeared from their everyday life. They told themselves they were just adjusting, that this was normal, that everyone feels weird after a change. But the truth was, they were experiencing something they didn't know how to name. Because avoidants don't always recognize loneliness in the way others do. They don't sit there thinking, I miss them so much. Instead, it shows up as restlessness, as boredom, as irritation, as a strange sense that something just isn't right, even when everything looks fine on the surface. So they turned to distractions. They buried themselves in work. They spent more time on their phone. They watched more shows. They hung out with people who didn't ask deep questions. They tried new routines, new habits, new ways to keep their mind busy. And at first, it helped. The noise covered up the silence. The movement kept them from sitting with their thoughts. But distractions have limits, because no matter how busy someone is, there are always small moments where the truth slips through. A song comes on that reminds them of you. They pass by a place you once went together. Someone says something kind to them, and it triggers a memory of how you used to speak to them. And suddenly, there's that feeling again. That quiet, heavy awareness that something important is no longer there. And they start to realize that none of these distractions actually replace what they lost. Work doesn't replace emotional safety. Casual conversations don't replace deep understanding. Entertainment doesn't replace genuine connection. What they never realized is that you weren't just another person in their life. You were someone who created a space where they could exist without pretending, even if they didn't always show it, even if they sometimes pulled away, even if they acted like they didn't need it. That space mattered more than they understood at the time. Because with you, they didn't always have to explain themselves. You noticed their moods. You gave them time when they needed it. You didn't push in ways that felt suffocating. You tried to understand the parts of them they kept hidden from everyone else. And now, in your absence, they're starting to see the difference. Because the world without you feels more mechanical, more distant, more transactional. Conversations feel shorter. People feel less patient. Interactions feel more conditional. And slowly, a thought starts forming in the back of their mind, not loud enough to scare them, but strong enough to linger. A thought that says, maybe what they had with you wasn't as heavy as they once believed. Maybe it wasn't pressure. Maybe it was connection. And maybe they misunderstood the difference. Because the truth is, avoidants often confuse emotional closeness with emotional danger. They assume that if someone gets too close, it will eventually lead to disappointment, control, or pain. So when feelings deepen, their instinct is to step back, to create distance before anything can hurt them. And in that moment, it feels like the right decision. It feels logical. It feels safe. But what they don't see is what they're leaving behind. They don't see how rare it is to find someone who genuinely cares without trying to control them. They don't see how uncommon it is to find someone who respects their need for space while still offering warmth. They don't see how difficult it is to replace someone who truly tried to understand them. And only after the silence stretches long enough, only after the nights feel a little colder, only after the distractions lose their effect, do they start to notice what's missing. And that's when the loneliness starts to feel real, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quiet and persistent, like an echo in an empty room, like a thought that keeps returning, even when they try to push it away, because deep down, they're starting to understand something they never realized when you were still there. They didn't just lose a relationship, they lost someone who made their world feel softer, someone who made connection feel safe, someone who gave them warmth without demanding perfection. And that realization, it doesn't hit all at once. It arrives slowly, quietly, and it stays longer than they ever expected. And that realization, it doesn't arrive with drama or loud regret. It slips in quietly the same way your presence once did. There was no big moment where they suddenly understood everything. Instead, it was a series of small, almost invisible shifts inside them. A subtle awareness that something used to feel different, something used to feel calmer, safer, easier. And they start to look back, not in a dramatic, emotional way, but in the quiet corners of their mind. And when they do, they begin to see something they never noticed before, the safety they once had with you. It wasn't the kind of safety they openly admitted. They never sat down and said, I feel secure here. Avoidants rarely talk like that. Instead, it showed up in other ways. It showed up in how they could sit next to you in silence without feeling pressure, and how they didn't have to constantly perform or impress, and how they could have bad days and still feel accepted. They didn't notice it then because it didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel intense. It just felt normal. And that's exactly why they took it for granted. Because when something feels consistently calm and steady, it doesn't stand out in the moment. It only stands out when it's gone. Now, as they move through their days, they start noticing the contrast. Conversations feel different. People feel different. The emotional tone of their life feels sharper, colder, less forgiving. They find themselves being more guarded, more reserved, more careful about what they say and how they act. And without realizing it, they start missing the one place where they didn't have to do that. The one connection where they could lower their guard even just a little. And this is when another truth begins to surface. The emotional wall they built to protect themselves, it didn't just keep pain out. It also kept connection out. It kept warmth out. It kept the one person who was trying to reach them out. And at the time, that wall felt necessary. It felt smart. It felt like self-protection. But now, in the quiet of their own company, that same wall starts to feel like a prison. Because the thing about emotional walls is that they don't just block one direction. They don't only keep others from coming in, they also keep the person inside from reaching out. And that's exactly what they're starting to feel, a kind of emotional isolation that they didn't expect. They thought distance would bring relief. They thought space would feel empowering, but instead it feels lonely in a way they can't easily explain. There's a moment that often comes and it's different for everyone. Sometimes it's a quiet Sunday afternoon. Sometimes it's a long drive alone. Sometimes it's a random evening where nothing feels particularly wrong, but nothing feels right either. And in that moment, the loneliness hits a little harder than usual. Not as a dramatic wave, but as a heavy awareness. An understanding that the person who once cared deeply is no longer part of their daily life. And for the first time, they stop and really feel that absence. They might not say, "I miss them." Avoidants don't always use those words. Instead, it shows up as a quiet thought. Things felt easier back then. Or there was someone who understood me. And that thought lingers longer than they expect because now they're starting to see something important. The difference between space and loss, when they pulled away, they told themselves they just needed breathing room. They convinced themselves they weren't losing anything important. They thought the connection would always be there in the background or that it wasn't as meaningful as it seemed. They believed they were simply creating space, not ending something valuable, but time has a way of revealing the truth. And the truth is, space is temporary. Loss is different. Loss has weight. Loss has permanence. Loss changes the emotional landscape in a way space never. And now they're starting to feel that difference because the space they once craved has turned into a quiet emptiness. The breathing room they wanted now feels like a room with no one in it, and they start to question something they never questioned before. Did they really need distance, or did they just need understanding? Did they actually want to leave, or were they just afraid of how much they were starting to feel? These questions don't come with clear answers. Avoidants rarely sit down and analyze their emotions in a direct way. Instead, these realizations show up in fragments, in memories, in comparisons, in quiet reflections they don't even notice they're having. And those reflections almost always lead back to you. They start remembering the small things, not the big emotional conversations or the dramatic moments. It's the simple, everyday things that come back first. The way you listened without interrupting, the way you noticed when something felt off, even when they didn't say anything, the way you gave them space without making them feel abandoned, the way you accepted their quiet days without demanding explanations. And that's when another realization begins to form. The things you did weren't common. Not everyone has that kind of patience. Not everyone has that kind of emotional awareness. Not everyone stays calm when someone pulls away. Most people meet with anger or pressure or emotional ultimatums. But you didn't. You tried to understand. You tried to stay gentle. You tried to create a space where they could exist without fear. And now, as they interact with other people, they start to feel the difference. They notice how quickly others take things personally, how fast people expect responses, reassurance, or emotional intensity. They notice how rare it is to find someone who doesn't demand constant closeness. And slowly, a quiet thought starts to settle in their mind. Maybe what they had with you wasn't ordinary. Maybe it was something rare. But instead of expressing that realization, they keep it to themselves because pride is still there. Fear is still there. The emotional wall hasn't disappeared overnight. It's just starting to show cracks. And through those cracks, memories of you keep slipping in. The warmth of your presence, the patience in your voice, the way you stayed, even when they were hard to reach. And that's when the loneliness begins to take on a different shape. It's no longer just a vague emptiness, it becomes something more specific. It becomes the absence of you, the absence of the one person who made them feel quietly safe, the absence of the one person who didn't force their heart open, but gently waited for it. And deep down, even if they won't admit it, they're starting to realize something they never understood when you were still there. You weren't just someone who loved them. You were someone who made their world feel softer. And now, without that softness, everything feels a little colder than they expected. And now, without that softness, everything feels a little colder than they expected. It's not something they say out loud. It's not even something they fully admit to themselves, but there's a quiet awareness growing inside them. A realization that the emotional atmosphere of their life has changed. The warmth that once existed in the background is no longer there. The comfort they once felt without even noticing it has disappeared. And now, in its place, there's a kind of emotional distance that feels heavier than they thought it would. They start to think about the way you used to communicate. Not just the words you said, but the way you understood things that were never spoken. Because with you, they didn't always have to explain themselves. You picked up on their moods, you noticed the shifts in their tone, you sensed when they needed space, and when they needed quiet support, you spoke an emotional language that didn't rely on constant words. And that kind of understanding is rare, especially for someone who struggles to express what they feel. Most people expect clarity. Most people want explanations. They want reassurance. They want emotional consistency. But you were different. You didn't demand everything to be spoken out loud. You didn't treat their silence as rejection. You didn't take every moment of distance personally. You tried to understand the emotional patterns behind their behavior. And even when it was hard, you stayed present in your own gentle way. Pain, now as they move through life without you, they start to notice how uncommon that kind of emotional language really is. They realize that most people don't read between the lines the way you did. Most people don't offer patience without conditions. Most people don't stay soft in the face of emotional distance. And slowly, they begin to see something they never saw before. You weren't just someone who cared, you were someone rare. This realization doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece. It shows up when someone reacts harshly to their silence. It shows up when a conversation feels too demanding, too intense, too fast. It shows up when they notice how quickly others lose patience. And in those moments, a quiet comparison forms in their mind. You didn't react like this. You didn't push like this. You didn't make them feel like they were always on the verge of disappointing you. And that's when the regret begins to take shape. Not loud regret, not the kind that turns into dramatic apologies or emotional confessions. Avoidant regret is quieter than that. It lives in the background. It shows up as thoughts they don't share with anyone. Thoughts like, maybe I misunderstood them, or maybe they weren't the problem, or even maybe I let go of something I won't easily find again. But these thoughts stay inside because expressing regret would mean facing vulnerability. It would mean admitting they cared more than they let on, and that's still something they struggle with. So instead, the regret becomes something private, something they carry alone, something they feel in small, quiet moments when no one is watching. And inside them, a conflict begins to grow. A silent tug of war between two parts of their personality. One part still wants connection, still remembers the warmth, still thinks about the safety they once felt with you. But the other part is still afraid, still cautious, still convinced that getting too close will eventually lead to pain or loss of control. And these two parts don't easily agree with each other. There are moments when they feel the urge to reach out, moments when your name crosses their mind, or when a memory feels too strong to ignore. In those moments, their heart leans toward connection. It whispers, maybe you should say something. Maybe you should check in. Maybe they'd understand. But almost immediately, the other voice appears. The voice of pride, the voice of fear, the voice that says, what if they don't respond the way you hope? What if they've moved on? What if you look weak? And just like that, the moment passes, the urge fades, the phone stays still, the message remains unwritten. Because for avoidance, pride is often a shield. It protects them from situations where they might feel rejected, exposed, or emotionally dependent. And even when they miss you, that shield is hard to put down. So instead of reaching out, they stay silent. They tell themselves it's better this way. They convince themselves that time will take care of everything, that the feelings will fade, that the memories will lose their intensity. But what they don't realize is that silence doesn't always erase emotions. Sometimes it just gives them more space to grow. And in that silence, they start learning emotional lessons they never expected, because loneliness has a way of teaching things that comfort never does. It forces reflection. It creates moments of stillness where distractions can't reach. And in those moments, they begin to see patterns in their own behavior. They start to notice how often they've pulled away from closeness, how often they've chosen distance over vulnerability, how often they've walked away from people who were trying to care. These realizations don't come with clear labels like attachment style or emotional defense mechanisms. Instead, they show up as simple thoughts. Thoughts like, why do I always leave when things start to feel real? Or why does closeness make me uncomfortable, even when the person is kind? And even though they may not fully understand the answers, the questions themselves start to change something inside them. They begin to see that their need for distance isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about their own fear of being known too deeply, their fear of being depended on, their fear of losing control over their own emotional world. And when they look back at the connection they had with you, they start to see it differently. They start to realize that you weren't trying to trap them. You weren't trying to control them. You were just trying to love them in a way that felt safe and steady. And that's when your memory begins to take on a new meaning in their mind. They don't just remember the arguments or the moments where they felt overwhelmed. They start remembering the softer parts, the way you smiled at them when least expected it, the way you respected their quiet moods, the way you stayed even when they were hard to reach. And in those memories, you become more than just someone from their past. You become a symbol of something they didn't fully appreciate at the time. Because now they're starting to see the version of you that mattered most, not the one involved in conflict or emotional tension, but the one who offered warmth without pressure, the one who tried to understand instead of accuse, the one who made connection feel less frightening than it usually does. And that version of you stays in their thoughts longer than they expect. And with that, another question begins to form. A quiet, uncomfortable question that keeps returning no matter how much they try to ignore it. What if I pushed away the one person who truly saw me? It's not a question they like to sit with. It makes them feel exposed. It makes them feel uncertain, but it keeps coming back. Because deep down, they're starting to realize that what they had with you wasn't ordinary, and losing something rare always leaves a mark, even on the most guarded hearts. And losing something rare always leaves a mark, even on the most guarded hearts. It may not look like regret in the way most people imagine it. There are no dramatic confessions, no long emotional messages, no sudden breakdowns. With them, everything happens quietly, internally, almost invisibly. But something is changing inside them, whether they admit it or not. The loneliness they once ignored is starting to soften parts of them that used to feel untouchable. The emotional armor they built over the years is no longer as solid as it once was. It hasn't shattered, but it's not as rigid, not as cold. Because when someone spends enough time alone with their thoughts, without the comfort of the person who once cared deeply, they start to feel things they used to avoid. They start noticing how quiet everything feels. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that reminds them there's no one waiting to hear about their day, no one checking in just to make sure they're okay, no one who truly sees the small shifts in their mood. And in that quiet, their defenses begin to loosen little by little. They may not call it growth, they may not even recognize it as change. But the loneliness is teaching them something. It's showing them that independence without connection doesn't feel as powerful as they once believed. It's showing them that emotional distance doesn't always protect them from pain. Sometimes it creates a different kind of pain, a quieter one, a slower one, but a deeper one. And in those quiet moments, your memory keeps returning, not as a sharp regret, not as a painful reminder, but as something softer, warmer, almost comforting. Because when they think about you now, they don't just see the moments where they felt overwhelmed. They start to see the moments where they felt understood. They remember the way you spoke to them during their quiet days, the way you didn't rush them, the way you didn't demand emotional performances, the way you accepted their slower pace, even when it wasn't easy. And those memories begin to reshape how they see the past. What once felt like pressure now looks more like patience. What once felt like emotional weight now feels more like emotional support. And slowly, the version of you that lives in their memory becomes clearer. It's not the version tied to conflict or fear. It's the version who offered warmth, the version who made them feel safe without asking them to be someone they weren't, the version who stayed gentle even when their walls were high. They start replaying certain moments in their mind, small ones, quiet ones, the kind that didn't seem important at the time. A conversation where you listened more than you spoke, a day where you gave them space without making them feel guilty, a moment where you showed care without expecting anything in return. And now those moments feel bigger than they did before. Because now they understand something they didn't understand then. You weren't just another person in their life. You were someone who made emotional closeness feel less threatening. Someone who created a space where they didn't have to constantly protect themselves. Someone who offered connection without control. And that realization doesn't come without discomfort. Because once they see it, they can't unsee it. The question keeps returning. What if I lost someone I wasn't supposed to lose? It lingers in their mind, especially during the quiet hours. And even if they try to distract themselves, even if they try to stay busy, the thought finds its way back. At the same time, something inside them is shifting. The loneliness is no longer just emptiness. It's becoming a kind of teacher. It's forcing them to look at their patterns, to look at how often they've walked away when things started to feel real, to look at how their fear of closeness may have cost them something meaningful. And this internal shift is slow, almost invisible. There are no sudden transformations, no dramatic personality changes, but there's a subtle softening, a quiet awareness that maybe, just maybe, connection isn't the enemy they always believed it was. They may still feel fear. They may still struggle with vulnerability, but the loneliness is showing them that emotional walls come with a price. And that price is the absence of warmth, the absence of understanding, the absence of the one person who once made their world feel softer. And as they sit with that realization, another thought begins to form, a quieter one, but deeper. They start to wonder what you're doing now, whether you've moved on, whether someone else is giving you the warmth you once gave them. And that thought carries a strange mixture of emotion. Not jealousy exactly, not regret in the traditional sense, just a quiet sadness mixed with the awareness that they might have let something rare slip away. Because now they see you differently. They see the patience you had, the understanding you offered, the emotional safety you created, and they realize that not everyone is capable of giving that. Not everyone knows how to stay soft in the face of emotional distance. Not everyone knows how to love someone who struggles to open up. And this is the realization that changes everything inside them. You weren't just someone who loved them. You were someone who made them feel safe in a way they didn't even recognize at the time. You were someone who gave them space without abandoning them. Someone who understood their silence without turning it into conflict. Someone who made connection feel gentle instead of overwhelming. And now, in your absence, they feel the difference. They feel how rare that kind of connection really was. They feel the emptiness where your understanding used to be. They feel the quiet echo of a presence that once made their world feel warmer. They may not reach out. They may not say anything. They may continue to carry their pride and their fear. But deep down, something inside them has changed. Because once someone experiences a connection that feels safe, truly safe, it leaves an imprint. And even if they walk away from it, even if they hide behind their walls, that imprint doesn't disappear. It stays with them in their thoughts, in their memories, in the quiet moments when they finally stop running from their own emotions. And in those moments, they begin to understand the truth they never saw before. You weren't just a chapter in their life. You were a rare kind of present, the kind that doesn't come around often, the kind that quietly changes a person even after you're gone.